In some of our previous videos, we looked at the stations, stops, and electrical infrastructure of the Chicago, Aurora, and Elgin Railway that served communities from Chicago all the way west to many of the towns and cities along the Fox River from 1902 until 1957. And in those videos, we looked at the positive aspects of trade and transportation that the CA&E brought to the communities it served.
But in this video, we'll explore how the CA&E Railway affected people's lives for the worse, sometimes tragically so, due to accidents or safety issues related to the railway. To do this, we scoured dozens of local newspapers looking for CA&E Railway-related accidents from its inception in the early part of the 20th century to its closure in 1957. And we'll highlight just some of these stories in this video.
Before we begin, we wanted to give a quick summary of the incidents and accidents that we found during our investigation. Our newspaper research compiled over 165 accidents from 1902 to 1960, which is most likely an understatement, perhaps by a factor of 2 or more. These reported accidents resulted in over 140 fatalities and more than 400 injuries. Again, these numbers are likely underreported.
Although the CA&E was famously an electric railway, with an infamous third rail running along most of the line with 600 volts of power, only about 20% of these incidents were electrocutions, most of those being fatal. Most accidents were collisions with automobiles at railway crossings, followed in roughly equal amounts by pedestrian collisions, electrocutions, train collisions, and then about 10% due to other circumstances, such as suicides, robberies, or collisions with horse-drawn wagons. More than 60% of these incidents occurred during the first 20 years of the railway's operation, with accidents, fatalities, and injuries tailing off dramatically over time. We should also point out that many of these accidents and fatalities involved CA&E employees.
There were several factors that contributed to these accidents, including the initial lack of railway safety regulations or equipment. Also, the different sound characteristics of electric trains versus steam-driven trains. The latter gave audible cues to drivers and pedestrians. The different speeds and acceleration characteristics of electric trains. In other words, people simply misjudged the train's speed. And finally, less reliable automobile technology, resulting in cars stalling out on inclined railway crossings.
And just as we started our original CA&E journey with the Elgin Branch, we'll start this series with the Elgin Branch. And we'll start right here at the corner of Chicago Street and Riverside Drive in Elgin, Illinois, where the Elgin Terminal once stood.
36-year-old John Shedden lived a few blocks to the north of the Elgin Terminal. On the evening of Friday, April 2nd, 1909, John was seriously annoyed because his telephone wouldn't stop ringing. He decided that he was going to cut the telephone lines at the utility pole at the back of his yard. Unfortunately for John, the telephone lines had come in contact with the high voltage AE&C wires, and when he went to cut them, he was electrocuted and instantly killed.
In September of 1912, 39-year-old AE&C electrician George Dudenhofer was electrocuted and killed when working with wires high atop utility poles just over the bridge behind us on the west side of the Fox River at the corner of North State Street and Highland Avenue. Dozens of onlookers were horrified to witness his electrocution when he touched one of the high voltage AE&C wires, with his clothing and entire body bursting into flames.
In May of 1915, John Fabina, a local racetrack worker who had been confined to the Elgin Asylum for a period of time, wandered away from the asylum, crossed over the Fox River, and then walked down the CA&E line, where he was unfortunately killed by electrocution when he came in contact with the third rail.
Perhaps the saddest story of all associated with the Elgin Terminal, which once stood behind us here, was that of Alma Fisher. Alma was a 15-year-old farm girl from Rutland Township, Kane County, Illinois, which is just several miles to the northwest of Elgin. On Saturday, June 25, 1910, Alma made a trip into the city of Elgin to return her older sister's baby, who had spent some time with the Fisher family prior. Alma was supposed to have returned home via the 9 p.m. train, but instead met with some other young people at the station, going to watch a picture show. The subsequent details of her visit are clouded in mystery, but she reportedly stayed near the train terminal well into the evening, and appears to have been pursued by one or two young men. A little later, just about midnight, and just about midway between the Elgin Terminal to the north and the National Street Station to the south, the young woman is said to have stepped out of the weeds directly in front of a southbound AE&C train. The motorman later testified that he blew his whistle to warn her, but she merely shrugged her shoulders before being cut down and killed instantly.
We're here now at the National Street Station, also known as the Watch Factory Station. They're located in front of me and behind me. This station was a very heavily used station, and as a result had a large number of incidents and accidents associated with it. On Sunday, February 21st, 1909, 14-year-old Arvid Johnson, a runaway from Rockford, who was unfamiliar with the area and unfamiliar with the hazardous third rail, was crossing here with a companion. Arvid was severely shocked when he came in contact with the third rail. But fortunately for him, a policeman who was also here looking for him was able to grab Arvid off the third rail before he was more seriously injured.
In May of 1922, 27-year-old John Baum decided to go fishing right here along the Fox River, just south of the Elgin Watch Factory. During his outing, he had been drinking and eventually fell into the river. He pulled himself out of the river soaking wet, stumbled up the riverbank, and then fell upon the trackway and the third rail. He was electrocuted and killed instantly.
"21-year-old Donald B. Shedden was the nephew of John Shedden, who had been electrocuted in 1909, a few blocks north of the Elgin Terminal, when he had cut his own telephone lines. In the summer of 1914, Donald Shedden was working for the engineering department of the AE&C Railway. On June 30th, Donald was walking south along the AE&C line here towards the Collingbourne station. He did not hear a southbound AE&C train coming. He was struck and killed instantly underneath the viaduct of the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railway. This location is just 1,000 feet north of the Collingbourne station.
In the same area of the viaduct, in May of 1917, there was another death. Just to the east of the trackway, right here near the intersection of Bluff City Boulevard and Raymond Street, there was a factory called the Elgin Butter Tub Company. And in 1917, Fred Cook, a maintenance worker or section hand for the AE&C, was working along this section of the railway and was unfortunately electrocuted and killed.
On August 7, 1957, 12-year-old Dale Arthur Raditz was playing along the CA&E line close to the Collingbourne station. In the course of his play, Dale accidentally came in contact with the third rail and was severely shocked and injured. Dale's injuries resulted in the amputation of one of his feet.
Here at the Hollywood or Renwick station, which once stood in the clump of trees right behind me here, the section of track that lay just to the south of this station was once chock full of industrial interchanges and sidings for gravel companies and electric companies and so on. As a result of that, it was prone to train collisions, one of the first of which happened in April of 1907, when a northbound AE&C train traveling in this direction at about 50 miles an hour, due to an open switch, went off into a siding and collided with a freight train, telescoping that freight train. Many of the passengers on the AE&C train were injured, including 4 members of an all-Chicago baseball team that was headed towards Rockford for a weekend series. In spite of the injuries, however, the games scheduled in Rockford went on as planned.
Behind me is one of the relics of the many bridges, sidings, and interchanges that once existed along this stretch of the railway. In February of 1909, 6 people were injured as a result of a collision of 2 trains. In that accident, a passenger train was shunted onto a siding as a result of an open switch. Unfortunately, the siding was already occupied by an AE&C work train. Of the 6 people injured, the flagman for the AE&C work train sustained the most serious injuries.
This lonely Clintonville station was the scene of several accidents over the years. One of the first was in November of 1904, when a northbound AE&C train traveling in this direction struck a horse-drawn wagon carrying a large load of stone traveling east along the road. 3 people were critically injured, including the wagon driver, Chris Krieger of Elgin, the motorman of the train, F.H. Chapman of Wheaton, and Mrs. W.M. Hodges of Chicago. The wagon driver later testified that his view was obscured of the coming train by a large pile of stone that sat in front of the Clintonville station just to the south of the road.
On January 17, 1908, 31-year-old Albert Kretschmer of Kretschmer Brothers was delivering groceries in a horse-drawn wagon and heading east at the Clintonville crossing. Albert was struck by an AE&C train and killed. His horse, however, was uninjured.
In November of 1911, 25-year-old relief operator Stephen C. Kiley of the AE&C was struck and killed right here at the Clintonville station by an AE&C train.
On July 26, 1917, 55-year-old Abraham Lincoln Lade of Elgin was killed at the Clintonville crossing when his brand new automobile was hit by an AE&C train. Abraham's wife, who was riding in the back seat of the car, was unhurt.
In December of 1937, 47-year-old farmer Carl Schrader of Bartlett, Illinois, was killed when passing over the Clintonville crossing behind me in the middle of a snowstorm by a passing CA&E train.
On January 16, 1948, 23-year-old Lawrence C. Theade of Ontarioville, a World War II Marine Corps veteran, was killed when the laundry truck he was driving skidded on the ice into the side of a passing CA&E train at the Clintonville crossing.
The St. Charles Road crossing behind me was another lonely rural crossing, set at an oblique angle to the road, which made it difficult for vehicles traversing it. In April of 1936, 57-year-old dairy operator Louis Kampmeyer, brother of the King County Sheriff Albert Kampmeyer, was killed while going over this very crossing. His vehicle was consumed in flames moments after the crash.
On September 26, 1947, Waldo M. Hennings, the 57-year-old postmaster of Wayne, plowed into a CA&E train approximately 3 miles south of Elgin, derailing the train and seriously injuring himself. Hennings died 3 days later.
In May of 1905, speeding along at 45 miles per hour, an AE&C train heading toward Chicago ran into an open switch 4 miles south of Elgin, just a short distance north of the St. Charles stop, injuring an entire Elgin baseball team, along with several other passengers, including the AE&C switchman and the AE&C motorman. The open switch shunted the speeding train onto the siding leading down to the Illinois Central Railroad, where several freight cars were parked. The entire front end of the Chicago-bound car was crushed, telescoping the cars and spewing broken timbers into the passenger cars.
The crossing of the Great Western and AE&C railroads, as well as the location of the electric substation here at Prince Crossing, proved to be the cause of multiple accidents over the years. On July 8, 1910, 2 trains collided in a head-on collision at Ingalton, the original name for Prince Crossing. In this accident, a westbound train was slowing down and coming to a stop as it prepared to move on to a siding, when it was hit head-on at speed by an eastbound train whose vision had been obscured by the topography of the land.
Behind me is the crossing of the Chicago Great Western Railway heading east-west and the AE&C Railway heading north and south. On November 1913, a gas-powered speeder carrying 3 AE&C electrical engineers coming down the hill and under the crossing at speed couldn't hold the curve and jumped the rails near the Ingalton station here, just in this direction, Prince Crossing. Killed was 34-year-old Edward Chapman, an electrical engineer for the AE&C. The chief electrical engineer, also a passenger, William Dunbar, was seriously injured when he was thrown against the third rail and was critically burned. The third passenger, Henry C. Eggers, also an electrical engineer, was also seriously injured.
On July 24, 1916, 37-year-old Henry C. Eggers, the foreman for the AE&C construction and maintenance crew, and the same Henry C. Eggers who had survived the gas speeder accident 3 years earlier, was electrocuted and killed at Ingalton, near the same location of the gas speeder accident, as he climbed past the high voltage lines on a utility pole. Although he did not physically contact the lines, his heavy perspiration on a hot summer day resulted in high voltage current arcing through his body. The shock sent Henry plummeting to the ground, where he fractured his skull. He did not survive his injuries.
In January of 1920, a Great Western train car decoupled and derailed from a passing Great Western train that was going over the viaduct behind me here. The train car rolled down the embankment onto the AE&C line below, and shortly thereafter, a night train of the AE&C came barreling down that hill behind us, rounding that curve, and barreled into the freight car that was still sitting on the AE&C line. The motorman of the AE&C train, Absalom Beecher Hobbs of Wheaton, 53 years old, was killed, as well as the ticketmaster of the Ingalton station just to the south of us, Alfred Peter Anderson. The conductor of the train, Walter Blazier of Wheaton, was also injured.
Sometime during the night of July 4th, 1905, about midway between the Geneva Road Station and the Prince Crossing Station. 40-year-old Jay Ruba of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, was electrocuted and killed as a result of touching the third rail while he was walking east along the Elgin Branch of the AE&C.
In late October of 1906, 48-year-old Christian Kahl of Elgin took a misstep as he was stepping from the Geneva station platform right behind us here. He fell onto the AE&C tracks just as an AE&C train was passing. It broke his leg and crushed his arm and foot. Covered in blood and in excruciating pain, he crawled a few hundred feet north along County Farm Road to the nearest house, belonging to the Kress family, who then heard his moans and cries for help coming from outside. They summoned the AE&C Railway Company for assistance, who sent 2 surgeons to attend to him.
Jewell Road in its early days was another one of the lonely rural crossings that had a bad reputation with the locals for close calls and accidents. One of the worst of these occurred on Saturday, August 31st, 1912. Herbert Landon was out for a drive with his father and uncle in his brand new automobile. Herbert's car was hit by an AE&C train that was heading northwest at about 30 miles an hour. Herbert himself had been heading east on Jewell Road, a little bit west of the city of Wheaton. His car was totally demolished and tossed into a culvert along the side of the railroad. Killed were Herbert Batten Landon, an affluent 44-year-old property owner from Elgin, along with his 72-year-old father, Charles Landon. The uncle, Dwight K. Landon of New York, was seriously injured. Due to the force of the crash, the bodies of all 3 men were hurled tens of feet from the automobile. Train passengers were shaken, but sustained no serious injuries. Some witnesses reported that the automobile had stalled on the crossing, while other witnesses suggested that the auto had attempted to beat the train to the crossing. A large crowd gathered to attend to the injured, although some were said to have taken souvenirs from the crash site.
We hope that you found this video of interest, although we do understand that it is filled with great tragedy for the people involved in these accidents. However, it does show a different side to these interurban railways, a human side, especially at a time when safety regulations for these railways was seriously lacking, resulting in death and injury to employees, passengers, and local residents. Things did improve over time, however. Over the ensuing decades, as a result of improvements to railway safety equipment, automobile technology, as well as local residents becoming more familiar with the sounds and movement of these electric trains, accidents associated with the railway dropped off markedly.
In this video, we've only described a few of the accidents that occurred along the Elgin Branch. There were, of course, many other accidents and tragedies that occurred along the other 4 branches of the CA&E, and we may explore those in future videos. In the meantime, please like, subscribe, and share this video, and leave us a comment. We'd love to hear from you.